Courtroom number 4 felt unusually cold that morning, not just because of the air conditioning, but because of the silence that lived inside its walls. This room had seen hundreds of endings, marriages reduced to paperwork, promises dissolved with signatures. People sat on wooden benches, each carrying their own private disaster. Some looked angry, some looked defeated, and some were just there to watch, because courtrooms, no matter how tragic, always attract spectators. Today's case looked simple. The clerk's voice echoed clearly. Case number 417. Daniel Brooks versus Sarah Brooks. Divorce by mutual consent. Daniel Brooks stood up first. Perfectly tailored grey suit. Calm posture. The kind of confidence that comes from always being in control. Daniel was a real estate developer, someone who treated everything like a transaction, including relationships. Beside him stood his attorney, Kevin Wright, polished and relaxed. This was the kind of case lawyers liked, quick, clean, and profitable. Then Sarah Brooks stood. She wore a simple cream-colored dress. No jewelry, no attempt to impress. Her hands were folded calmly, her face unreadable. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She looked tired. On the bench sat Judge Michael Anderson, mid-50s, sharp eyes, calm demeanor. He was known for two things, fairness and noticing details other people missed. He wasn't loud. He didn't dramatize. He listened. Judge Anderson opened the file. "Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Brooks," he said evenly, "I'm informed this divorce is by mutual consent. No children involved. Property settlement already agreed upon. Is that correct?" Kevin Wright stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. Both parties have agreed to an amicable separation. No disputes remain. We request the court to grant dissolution." Judge Anderson looked at Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, do you confirm?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied without hesitation. The judge turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Brooks?" She took a soft breath. Yes, that was it. To anyone watching, this case was already over. No shouting, no accusations, no tears. Judges saw dozens like this every week. Judge Anderson reached for his pen, then paused. "Has the property settlement deed been submitted?" The clerk handed over another file. "Yes, Your Honor." Deed and supporting documents are attached. Judge Anderson opened it slowly. He flipped through the pages, scanning line after line of legal language. The courtroom remained silent except for the faint sound of paper turning. Daniel sat comfortably, confident, relaxed. Sarah didn't move. Then the judge's finger stopped. His expression changed, just slightly, a detail so small most people would miss it. But Kevin Wright noticed. So did Daniel. Judge Anderson adjusted his glasses and read the line again. Kevin Wright smiled politely. "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" The judge looked up. "Mr. Wright," he said calmly, "this commercial property listed on page 7, Unit 12 Billions, who is the registered owner?" Kevin answered quickly. "It's part of the marital assets, Your Honor. Both parties have agreed." "I didn't ask who uses it," the judge interrupted. "I asked who owns it." Daniel's jaw tightened. Kevin glanced down at the page. "It's registered under Mrs. Brooks." The judge leaned back slightly, read the full name. Kevin hesitated for half a second. Then read, "Sarah Williams." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Anderson placed his pen down. "Sarah Williams. Not Sarah Brooks?" Sarah slowly raised her head. For the first time, her eyes met the judge's directly. There was no fear in them. Only control. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "Williams is my maiden name." The judge turned to Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, do you recognize this name?" Daniel forced a calm smile. "It's her previous name. She changed it after marriage." "That's normal." Judge Anderson's voice remained steady. "Then why is the deed still under the maiden name, and why is it listed as sole ownership, not marital property?" Daniel swallowed. Kevin stepped in quickly. "Your Honor, these are technicalities. The settlement resolves." The gavel tapped once. Technicalities are precisely why this court exists. The atmosphere shifted. People leaned forward. Phones were silenced. Interest returned. Judge Anderson looked at Sarah again. "Mrs. Williams, I'll ask you directly. Was this property purchased during the marriage, inherited or gifted?" Sarah paused. The silence felt heavy, like the room itself was waiting. "It was a gift," she said. Daniel's face went pale. "A gift from whom?" The judge asked. "My father." Judge Anderson raised an eyebrow. "Name?" Sarah answered calmly. "Richard Williams." Someone in the back whispered, "Oh." Judge Anderson froze for a fraction of a second. "Richard Williams," he repeated slowly. "As in former Chief Justice Richard Williams?" "Yes," Sarah replied. Daniel shifted in his seat. Judge Anderson straightened. "This divorce is no longer routine." He turned to the clerk. "Schedule a detailed hearing. Issue an immediate order. No sale, no transfer, no mortgage on this property until further review." Kevin Wright stood up. "Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Wright." Sarah exhaled quietly. Daniel didn't move. Judge Anderson closed the file, then looked directly at Daniel. "One final question, Mr. Brooks." Daniel looked up. "If this property belongs solely to your wife, then who signed as guarantor on the bank loan documents?" Daniel's eyes widened. Sarah turned toward him for the first time and said softly, "You know exactly who, Daniel." The courtroom fell silent again, but this time it wasn't routine silence. It was the silence before everything falls apart. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the tension didn't leave with the people. Daniel Brooks remained seated long after everyone else stood. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent, but Daniel barely heard him. One question kept echoing in his head like a gunshot. Who signed as guarantor on the bank loan documents? Because Daniel knew the answer. And so did Sarah. Judge Michael Anderson sat alone in chambers, the file still open in front of him. He had seen hundreds of divorce cases, some ugly, some heartbreaking, most forgettable. This one wasn't. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Richard Williams," he muttered to himself. That name wasn't just familiar. It carried weight. Years ago, before Anderson ever became a judge, Richard Williams had been the Chief Justice who rewrote how property law was interpreted in inheritance disputes. A man obsessed with detail. A man who never left loose ends. And now his daughter was standing in a courtroom, quietly watching her husband unravel. That alone told Judge Anderson one thing. This case was bigger than it looked. 2 hours earlier, before the hearing, Sarah Williams stood alone in her apartment, staring at the city through a glass window that overlooked everything Daniel once told her they owned together. The truth was simpler. None of it was his. The apartment, the commercial plaza, the initial capital, all hers, all protected. Sarah picked up her phone and scrolled through old messages. Messages she had never deleted, no matter how much Daniel had begged her to move on. "Daniel, it's just paperwork. I'll handle the bank. Trust me." "Daniel, they need a guarantor. It's temporary." "Daniel, you don't even need to be involved." She remembered the night clearly. Daniel had come home late, unusually quiet. He poured himself a drink and sat beside her like nothing was wrong. "Sarah," he said casually, "do you trust me?" That was the moment she stopped trusting him, because people who deserve trust don't ask for it. They prove it. Back to the court. The same day, Daniel and Kevin Wright sat in a private consultation room. Kevin shut the door and dropped his professional tone. "You didn't tell me the property was gifted," he said sharply. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "It doesn't matter. It's still part of the marriage." "No," Kevin snapped. "It matters a lot. Especially if it was gifted before marriage. Especially if it's under her maiden name." Daniel's voice lowered. "I needed leverage. The banks wouldn't approve the expansion loan without collateral." Kevin stared at him. "So you used her property?" "I didn't use it," Daniel shot back. "I leveraged it." Kevin leaned closer. "And the guarantor?" Daniel didn't answer. Kevin already knew. You signed, Kevin said slowly. You signed on her behalf. Daniel looked away. Kevin exhaled hard. Forgery. Fraud. Unauthorized representation. Daniel finally snay. Ped. She was my wife. That doesn't make it legal, Kevin said. That makes it worse. Sarah's sighed. The silence with teeth. Sarah met her lawyer, Emma Collins, in a quiet cafe across the street from the courthouse. Emma had been her lawyer long before this divorce. Long before Daniel knew Sarah wasn't just a supportive wife. They froze the property, Emma said. That's good. Sarah nodded. He took loans, didn't he? Emma slid a folder across the table. Bank statements, mortgage documents, guarantee forms. Sarah flipped through them slowly. Her signature was there, or something that looked like it. He practiced, Sarah said calmly. He practiced my handwriting. Emma studied her face. You're not surprised. I stopped being surprised 2 years ago, Sarah replied. Emma hesitated. There's something else. She pulled out another document. A business registration. Daniel had created a shell company, quietly. It listed Sarah Williams as a silent partner. Sarah smiled faintly. He thought using my name would protect him, she said. He didn't realize it would expose him. Judge Anderson, connecting the dots. Later that evening, Judge Anderson reviewed the file again. Something about Sarah's composure bothered him, not in a bad way, in a calculated way. Most people in her position panicked. She didn't. She waited. He made a call. Can you pull records on Daniel Brooks's commercial loans? He asked quietly. A pause. Then, yes, all of them. J. Judge Anderson looked at the deed again, at the name Sarah Williams. And for the first time he wondered, what if this divorce wasn't the beginning? What if it was the end game? The message Daniel didn't expect. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office. The city lights outside felt mocking. His phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. Sarah, you always said I didn't understand business. Another message. Sarah, tomorrow the court will... Daniel typed furiously. Daniel, you're overreacting. This can still be settled. 3 dots appeared, then stopped. No reply. Daniel leaned back, heart pounding. For the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the narrative. The bank investigation didn't begin loudly. It began quietly. No flashing lights, no subpoenas delivered in public. Just emails, internal audits, and a compliance officer who didn't like unanswered questions. At Northbridge Financial, senior compliance analyst Laura Chen stared at her screen longer than she should have. 3 commercial loans. Same borrower. Same guarantor. Same handwriting. Different dates. She zoomed in on the digital copies of the signatures. Years of training had taught her one thing. People can copy handwriting, but they can't copy pressure patterns. And these signatures? They were traced. Laura leaned back and picked up the phone. Pull the original guarantor verification files, she said. I want voice confirmations, not just paperwork. A pause. Then, yes. All 3 low. Anns. Daniel Brooks. Pressure cracks confidence. Daniel arrived at his office early the next morning, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful there. The glass walls felt transparent. The silence felt accusatory. His assistant handed him a coffee. Bank called twice, she said. Compliance department. Daniel's jaw clenched. Tell them I'm unavailable. She hesitated. They said it's urgent. Daniel waved her away. He opened his laptop and pulled up the shell company documents again. Brooks Urban Holdings LLC. On paper, it looked clean. On paper, Sarah Williams was listed as a silent partner. He had thought it was brilliant. If anything went wrong, her name would shield him. What he hadn't considered was what her name actually meant. Sarah Williams. The calm before the storm. Sarah sat in Emma Collins's office, reading through a stack of documents she already knew by heart. You don't have to attend the next hearing, Emma said. We can handle... I'll be there, Sarah replied calmly. Emma studied her. You're unusually prepared for someone in a divorce. Sarah smiled faintly. This isn't a divorce to him, she said. It's a transaction. I'm just correcting the math. Emma slid another file across the desk. Northbridge Financial flagged the loans. They're investigating forged guarantor signatures. Sarah nodded. My father warned me this would happen. Emma paused. Your father also wrote the precedent that governs this. Sarah looked up. Yes, she said. And Daniel never bothered to read it. The rule Daniel ignored. Years ago, Chief Justice Richard Williams authored a landmark opinion that reshaped property and financial liability law. A spouse may not pledge, guarantee, or encumber separate gifted or inherited property without explicit documented consent of the legal owner, regardless of marital status. It was known in legal circles as the Williams Rule. Daniel Brooks had built his empire assuming marriage meant shared risk. The law disagreed, and worse, violating the rule didn't just void contracts. It triggered criminal exposure. Judge Anderson, from suspicion to certainty. Judge Michael Anderson reviewed the precedent late that night. He knew it well, every judge did. But what caught his attention was something else. Daniel hadn't just violated the rule once. He had repeated it. Pattern mattered, and patterns turned civil matters into criminal ones. Judge Anderson picked up the phone again. I want a certified handwriting analysis on the guarantor signatures, he said. And I want the bank compliance officer present at the next hearing. A pause. Yes, he added. This court will retain jurisdiction. He hung up and stared at the file. This was no longer about marriage. This was about intent. The call that changed everything. Daniel's phone rang at 7:14 p.m., unknown number. He answered anyway. Mr. Brooks, a woman's voice said calmly. This is Laura Chen from Northbridge Finance. Xiao. We're conducting an internal compliance review related to your commercial loans. Daniel forced a smile into his voice. I'm happy to help. We noticed discrepancies in the guarantor confirmations, Laura continued. Specifically, we have no recorded verification call from Miss Sarah Williams. Daniel's stomach tightened. There must be a mistake. We thought so too, Laura said. Which is why we pulled the audio logs. Silence. Mr. Brooks, she said, did Miss Williams ever speak to our bank directly? Daniel didn't answer. Laura didn't need him to. In the absence of verification, she said, these guarantees may be considered unauthorized. Our legal department has been notified. The line went dead. Daniel sat still. Then he laughed, short, sharp, panicked. He had always believed consequences were negotiable. Sarah's message. Again. Daniel's phone buzzed. Another message from Sarah. Sarah, my father used to say, the law is patient. People aren't. Daniel typed back immediately. Daniel, you're trying to destroy me. The reply came seconds later. Sarah, no, I'm letting the truth catch up. Daniel threw the phone onto the desk. For the first time, fear crept in, not the fear of losing money, but the fear of losing control. The next hearing, a shift in power. The courtroom was fuller this time. Word had spread. Bank representatives sat in the front row. A handwriting analyst reviewed documents quietly. Legal observers took notes. Judge Anderson entered. This court will now address additional findings related to property encumbrance and financial guarantees, he said. Daniel sat stiffly. Sarah sat calmly. Judge Anderson looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Brooks, he said, you represented your wife as a guarantor on multiple financial instruments without verified consent. Daniel's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client disputes. The bank doesn't, the judge interrupted. And neither does the handwriting analysis. He turned to the clerk. Mark this case for potential criminal referral pending final review. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Criminal. Daniel's face drained of color. Judge Anderson concluded evenly. This court will not be used to sanitize fraud under the label of divorce. He struck the gavel. Courtroom number 4 had changed. What was once a quiet space for routine divorces now felt like a pressure chamber. Every seat was filled. Legal observers lined the walls. A quiet buzz lived in the air, the kind that only appears when people know they're about to witness something irreversible. Daniel Brooks sat stiffly beside Kevin Wright. His confidence was gone, replaced by a rigid stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when a person knows the room is no longer on their side. Across the aisle, Sarah Williams sat with her lawyer, Emma Collins. Calm, composed, almost detached, Judge Michael Anderson entered without ceremony. "Call the next witness," he said, the handwriting expert. "Dr. Helen Moore," the clerk announced. A woman in her late 40s took the stand. Sharp eyes, neutral expression, no theatrics. She placed a thick folder on the desk and adjusted the microphone. "Dr. Moore," Judge Anderson began, "state your qualifications for the record." "I hold a doctorate in forensic document examination," she said. 22 years of experience. I've testified in over 300 cases involving signature authentication." Kevin Wright stood. "Doctor, did you examine the guarantor signatures attributed to Sarah Williams?" "Yes, and your conclusion." Dr. Moore opened her folder and displayed enlarged images on the screen. These signatures were not written by the same person who authored the verified samples of Miss Williams's handwriting. A ripple passed through the room. She continued calmly. "The strokes show hesitation, inconsistent pressure, and most importantly, tracing marks consistent with imitation." Kevin Wright cleared his throat. "Is it possible she signed under stress?" Dr. Moore didn't hesitate. "No. Stress does not change pressure patterns at this level." Judge Anderson leaned forward. "In your expert opinion, were these signatures forged?" "Yes." The word landed heavily. Daniel's last line of defense. Kevin Wright stood quickly. "Your Honor, even if the signatures were forged, there is no proof my client personally committed the act." Judge Anderson nodded slightly. "A fair argument." He turned to Dr. Moore. "Doctor, is there any correlation between the forged signatures and known samples of Mr. Brooks's handwriting?" Dr. Moore clicked to the next slide. "Actually, yes." Daniel's breath caught. The spacing, slant, and connective strokes closely match Mr. Brooks's verified signatures, particularly the capital letters. Silence. Kevin Wright sat down slowly. Judge Anderson turned to Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, would you like to explain?" Daniel stood. His hands were clenched. "I built that business," he said. "I put everything into it. That property was just sitting there, unused capital." Sarah didn't react. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Daniel continued. "I did what I had to do." Judge Anderson's voice was quiet, but sharp. "You did what benefited you." Sarah speaks. "Finally." Judge Anderson turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Williams, do you wish to address the court?" Sarah stood. This time she didn't hesitate. "I trusted him," she said calmly. "Not because he earned it, but because I believed marriage meant protection." She paused. "My father taught me law," she continued. "He taught me that silence can be strategic, but truth always wins eventually." She looked directly at Daniel. "You didn't just forge my signature," she said. "You tried to turn my name into a shield for your crimes." Daniel looked away. Judge Anderson's passed. Judge Anderson leaned back, his expression distant for a moment. "This court has seen cases like this before," he said slowly. "Years ago, before I was a judge, I prosecuted a similar matter." The room stilled. A husband leveraged his wife's inherited property without consent. When it collapsed, she was left with nothing. He paused. She took her own life. A collective breath left the room. Judge Anderson looked at Daniel again. "I will not allow this court to be part of that story again, the document that changed the game." Emma Collins stood. "Your Honor, we have one additional exhibit." She handed a document to the clerk. Judge Anderson reviewed it carefully. His expression hardened. "This," he said, "is a notarized statement from Richard Williams, dated before the marriage." He read aloud, "Any property gifted to my daughter, Sarah Williams, shall remain her sole and separate property, not subject to marital encumbrance under any circumstance." Judge Anderson closed the file. That eliminates all ambiguity. The ruling and the shift. Judge Anderson struck the gavel. This court finds that the defendant, Daniel Brooks, engaged in unauthorized financial encumbrance, forgery, and misrepresentation. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. I am referring this matter for criminal prosecution, the judge continued. All related assets are frozen. Bail conditions will be set separately. He looked at Sarah. Mrs. Williams, your property rights are fully restored. Sarah exhaled. Slowly. For the first time, emotion flickered across her face. Relief. Daniel Brooks had always imagined many endings for his marriage. An inexpensive settlement, a quiet exit, maybe a short-term scandal that would fade once the next deal hit the news cycle. He had never imagined handcuffs. The sound was sharp, final, metal closing around his wrists as two officers stood on either side of him inside the courthouse corridor. Cameras waited outside, hungry and impatient. Mr. Brooks, one of the officers said calmly, you are being taken into custody pending formal charges of forgery, financial fraud, and unauthorized use of collateral. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kevin Wright stepped forward instinctively, lawyer brain still clinging to procedure. Your Honor, we intend to file for immediate. Judge Anderson didn't even look up from the bench. Counsel, the court has ruled. That was it. The moment Daniel stepped through the courthouse doors, the world he controlled turned against him. Reporters shouted his name. Cameras flashed. Someone yelled, "Did you forge your wife's signature?" Another voice asked, "Is this connected to your other developments?" Daniel kept his head down, not out of shame, but instinct. The same instinct that had carried him through risky deals and close calls for years. Survive first, explain later. Except this time there would be no later. By nightfall, his name was everywhere. Screens lit up with headlines. Real estate forums dissected his deals. Former partners issued distance-filled statements. Banks froze accounts. Projects stalled overnight. The LL company he once thought was invisible was now a spotlight. Brooks Urban Holdings LLC became evidence instead of protection. Inside a holding room, Daniel finally sat alone. No phone, no assistant, no board members. Just him and the quiet. For the first time in years, there was no deal he could negotiate his way out of. 3 days later, the prosecution added a witness. That detail hit harder than the arrest. Mark Ellison, Daniel's former CFO. When Mark walked into the courtroom, Daniel's chest tightened. Mark had been loyal, careful, the kind of man who always flagged risks before they became disasters. The prosecutor's voice was steady. Mr. Ellison, did you ever discuss the use of Sarah Williams' property with the defendant? Yes, Mark said plainly. And what did you advise? That it was illegal without her written consent. Explicit consent. The courtroom was silent. And Mr. Brooks's response? Mark hesitated just long enough to show this wasn't easy. He said marriage was consent. He said the law wouldn't care. Daniel stared straight ahead. The prosecutor nodded once. No further questions. That sentence, marriage is consent, spread through the room like poison. Across the aisle, Sarah Williams listened without moving. She wasn't surprised. She had stopped being surprised the night Daniel asked her if she trusted him. Later that afternoon, she sat across from Emma Collins again. The office felt quieter than usual, like even the walls were list. The prosecution is pushing for maximum sentencing, Emma said. Your testimony would strengthen their case. Sarah nodded slowly. And if I choose not to testify? She asked. Emma considered her words carefully. The evidence stands on its own, but your voice changes how this story is remembered. Sarah looked down at her hands. For years she had stayed silent because silence felt safer, controlled, strategic. But silence had also allowed Daniel to believe he could speak for her. I will testify, Sarah said finally, but not the way they expect. The courtroom was packed again when Sarah took the stand. Daniel looked up when she entered. This time he didn't look angry. He looked unsure. The prosecutor approached gently. Mrs. Williams, do you wish to pursue all available charges against the defendant? Sarah took a breath. No, she said. The room reacted instantly. Gasps, murmurs, confusion. The prosecutor blinked. Could you clarify? Sarah nodded. I want restitution, I want accountability, and I want the truth recorded in this court." She looked briefly toward Daniel, not with hatred, not with pity, with finality. "But I don't want my future defined by punishment," she continued. "I don't want to spend years tied to this man through appeals and resentments. I want separation, legally and emotionally." Daniel swallowed. Judge Anderson leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Williams, are you asking this court for leniency?" Sarah shook her head. "Oh, Your Honor, I'm asking for boundaries, consequences that end here." The room fell quiet. Judge Anderson studied her longer than most witnesses. He recognized something familiar in her words. Not mercy. Strength. That evening, Judge Anderson sat alone in chambers. He reread the testimony transcript, pausing on Sarah's words. Boundaries. Consequences that end here. Years ago, he had seen cases where punishment destroyed everyone involved. He had also seen cases where accountability allowed someone to walk away whole. Sarah wasn't protecting Daniel. She was protecting herself, and that distinction mattered. Outside, Daniel sat in a holding cell, staring at a wall that didn't care who he used to be. For the first time, the future wasn't something he could plan. It was something he had to face. Daniel Brooks learned very quickly that jail time moved differently than real life. Hours stretched, thoughts looped. Regret didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, each one heavier than the last. He replayed conversations, decisions, moments where he could have stopped, where he should have stopped. But the thing that haunted him most wasn't the arrest. It was Sarah's calm. The way she had looked at him in court, not angry, not broken, finished. That look told him something he had never truly understood before. He no longer mattered in her future. Meanwhile, the case moved forward without him. The prosecution didn't slow down just because Sarah had chosen Bounder. Rees over vengeance. In fact, her decision made the case cleaner, sharper, harder to attack, because now this wasn't about emotion. It was about facts. Judge Anderson convened a closed procedural hearing 2 days later. No media, no spectators, just lawyers, bank representatives, and one sealed envelope that had arrived that morning. He opened it slowly. Inside was a sworn affidavit from Northbridge Financial. They weren't just withdrawing the loans, they were escalating. The affidavit detailed internal emails, risk committee notes, and one critical discovery. Daniel Brooks had attempted to refinance the loans just weeks before the divorce filing, using updated financial projections that concealed the property's true ownership status. That mattered. It meant intent. Not panic, not confusion, planning. Judge Anderson felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that came when a case crossed an invisible line. He ordered the clerk to notify both parties. The next hearing would determine criminal liability, and it would be public. When Sarah received the notice, she didn't react immediately. She was standing in her father's old study, surrounded by shelves of law books that still smelled faintly of dust and ink. She had returned there after the arrest, not to hide, but to breathe. Emma Collins stood nearby, reading the notice twice. "They found refinancing attempts," Emma said quietly. "That changes things." Sarah nodded. "He never stops doubling down." Emma hesitated. "This could increase sentencing exposure." Sarah turned to her. "I know. Are you okay with that?" Emma asked. Sarah considered the question. "I didn't ask for punishment," she said. "I asked for truth. What the law does with truth isn't up to me." That answer stayed with Emma long after she left. Back in the detention center, Daniel received the news differently. Kevin Wright sat across from him in a cramped room, files spread out like a losing hand. "They found the refinancing attempt," Kevin said bluntly. "You didn't tell me about that." Daniel stared at the table. "It was just in case." Kevin exhaled sharply. "There is no just in case in criminal court." Daniel looked up. "What are my options?" Kevin didn't sugarcoat it. "Full cooperation, reduced exposure, or we fight and risk everything." Daniel laughed once bitterly. "Everything's already gone." Kevin leaned in. "Not yet." Daniel thought of Sarah's voice, calm, controlled. For the first time, he wondered if fighting wasn't about winning anymore. but about delaying the inevitable. The public hearing drew a crowd. This time, it wasn't curiosity. It was confirmation. Judge Anderson entered, his expression firm but measured. He listened as the prosecution laid out the refinancing attempt, the concealed disclosures, the internal bank warnings Daniel had ignored. Then Kevin Wright stood. "Your Honor," he said, "my client acknowledges poor judgment. There was no intent to defraud." Judge Anderson raised an eyebrow. "Then why attempt refinancing under false assumptions?" Kevin paused. Daniel felt the pause like a crack in the floor beneath him. Judge Anderson turned to the clerk. "Call the next exhibit." The screen lit up with an email. Daniel recognized it instantly. An email he had written at 2 a.m, half drunk, half arrogant. "Once the refinance clears, we'll be insulated. Sarah's name won't matter by then." The room went silent. Judge Anderson let the words hang there. Then he spoke. "Mr. Brooks, this court has afforded you every opportunity to explain your actions as negligent or misguided." He leaned forward. "You have instead demonstrated calculation." Daniel stood on instinct. "Your Honor," Judge Anderson raised a hand. "This court finds probable cause for criminal fraud, forgery, and willful misrepresentation." The gavel struck. Daniel felt something inside him finally give, not fear, acceptance. Across the room, Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, in release. The court ordered pre-trial detention pending formal charges. As Daniel was led away again, he turned once. Sarah was already standing, gathering her things. She didn't look back. Outside, reporters flooded the steps, but Sarah didn't stop. She walked past the noise, past the questions, into a quiet street where no one knew her name. For the first time in years, that felt right. Judge Anderson remained seated long after the room emptied. He looked at the case file one last time. This wasn't justice that screamed, it was justice that held. And sometimes he thought that was the kind that lasted. Daniel Brooks had stopped counting days. In pretrial detention, time lost its shape. There were no meetings to schedule, no calls to make, no leverage to apply. Just long hours and short conversations, most of them with his own thoughts. And those thoughts were turning against him. Kevin Wright sat across from him again, this time without files, without pretense. "They've offered a cooperation window," Kevin said quietly. Daniel looked up. "In exchange for what?" "Truth," Kevin replied. "Names, methods, other deals." Daniel laughed under his breath. "They want me to burn everyone." "They already know you're not alone," Kevin said. "They just need you to confirm it." Daniel leaned back against the cold wall. For years, he had played in a system where everyone bent rules just enough to pretend they weren't broken. He had believed silence was loyalty. Now silence felt like a sentence. "What happens if I cooperate?" Daniel asked. Kevin didn't hesitate. "Reduced charges. Possibly no prison time. And if I don't?" Kevin met his eyes. "They will make an example of you." Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood something painfully simple. The game he thought he controlled had been larger than him all along. 2 days later, Daniel signed the agreement. It wasn't dramatic, no ceremony, just NK on paper, and a single sentence that ended everything he once built. Meanwhile, Sarah Williams was packing boxes in her apartment. Not because she was forced to, because she wanted to. Each item she placed away felt lighter than the last. She wasn't running from the past. She was clearing space for something new. Emma Collins stood by the doorway watching. "He agreed to cooperate," Emma said. Sarah paused. "About what?" "Other developments. Other loans. A pattern." Sarah nodded slowly. "I figured." Emma hesitated. "They may ask you to testify again, against people you've never met." Sarah taped her box shut. "I already told my truth. That doesn't change." That night, Judge Anderson received the cooperation notice. Daniel Brooks would testify. The courtroom filled again days later, but this time the energy was different. Not curiosity, not outrage, expectation. Daniel entered in a suit that no longer fit him. He looked smaller, quieter. When he took the stand, his voice didn't shake, but it wasn't confident either. "I misrepresented ownership," he said plainly. "I forged signatures. I concealed risk." The prosecutor nodded. "And were you acting alone?" Daniel hesitated. He thought of the people who taught him shortcuts, the partners who laughed off compliance, the bankers who looked the other way. "No," he said. A murmur rippled through the room. He named names, not all of them, but enough. From the gallery, Sarah listened without expression. This was not vindication. It was accounting. Later, as the session adjourned, Judge Anderson called a brief recess. He watched Daniel being escorted out. Again, then he looked toward Sarah. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly but clearly, "the court acknowledges your restraint throughout this process." Sarah met his gaze. "I wasn't trying to be strong," she said. "I was trying to be done." Judge Anderson nodded. That evening, a final document arrived. It wasn't from the prosecution. It was from Sarah, a formal civil waiver. She withdrew from all remaining financial claims beyond restitution. No appeals, no countersuits, no prolonged litigation. Emma read it twice. "You're sure?" Sarah signed it. "I don't need more." The waiver did something unexpected. It collapsed the case timeline. With no outstanding civil disputes, sentencing could proceed swiftly. Public interest faded. Media moved on. Daniel Brooks would be remembered, but not mythologized, which, in its own way, was justice. On the last day of hearings, Judge Anderson delivered his final remarks. "This court recognizes accountability, not spectacle," he said, "and it recognizes when a party chooses closure over chaos." He looked at Sarah once more. "Mrs. Williams, you are free of this court." Sarah stood. For the first time since this began, the word free meant something real. She walked out without looking back. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent, alive, waiting. And Sarah stepped into it, finally unburdened. Daniel Brooks stood in silence as the courtroom settled for the last time. There were no cameras now, no shouting reporters, no spectacle, just polished wood, muted light, and the weight of consequences that had finally caught up. He had imagined this moment differently, louder, angrier, something he could fight against. Instead, it felt quiet. Judge Anderson entered and took his seat. He looked older than he had weeks ago, as if this case had taken something from him too. The clerk called the room to order and everyone stood, then sat. Daniel remained still. The prosecutor summarized the cooperation agreement, the forged signatures, the concealed refinancing attempt. The names Daniel had given up, the deals that would now unravel far beyond this courtroom. Kevin Wright spoke briefly, carefully choosing words that wouldn't sound like excuses. Daniel had accepted responsibility. He had cooperated fully. He had no prior criminal record. Then it was over. Judge Anderson folded his hands. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "this court has reviewed the facts, your cooperation, and the harm caused." Daniel lifted his eyes. "For years you operated under the belief that intelligence excused entitlement," the judge continued. "That confidence would replace consent." Daniel swallowed. "This court does not punish ambition," Judge Anderson said. "It punishes deception." The sentence was firm, measured, unavoidable, reduced due to cooperation, no grandstanding, no mercy speeches, just accountability laid out in months and terms and conditions. As the gavel struck, Daniel felt something settle inside him. Not relief, not rage, finality. He was led away quietly. No one followed. Outside the courthouse, the city carried on as if nothing remarkable had happened. People crossed streets. Phones buzzed. Life moved forward. Sarah Williams sat in her car 2 blocks away, hands resting on the steering wheel. She hadn't planned to attend the sentencing. She didn't need to hear the words spoken aloud. But she had come anyway, not for Daniel, for herself. When the courthouse doors opened and Daniel was escorted out the side entrance, Sarah didn't look away. She watched, not with satisfaction, not with grief, with closure. Daniel didn't see her. That was the point. Later that afternoon, Sarah met Emma Collins one last time in the same cafe across from the courthouse. It's done, Emma said. Sarah nodded. I know. You could have taken more, Emma added gently. Financially, legally. Sarah stirred her coffee slowly. I took what mattered. Emma smiled. You're free. Sarah looked out the window. For the first time in years, the word didn't feel abstract. That evening, Judge Anderson returned home later than us. Al. He placed his briefcase down and sat quietly at the kitchen table. The house was still. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at nothing for a long moment. He thought about Sarah's waiver, about her refusal to turn justice into vengeance. He thought about the woman years ago, the one who never got the chance to walk away whole. Cases ended, people moved on. But judges remembered. Anderson reached for his phone and typed a short message to an old colleague. Sometimes closure is the strongest sentence we can give. He didn't send it. He didn't need to. Across town, Sarah stood in an empty apartment, boxes stacked neatly near the door. She had sold the place quietly. No announcements, no explanations. She picked up the last box and paused, scanning the room one final time. This was where she had waited, where she had doubted herself, where silence had once felt safer than truth. She turned off the lights and closed the door. Outside, the air felt lighter. She didn't know exactly where she was going yet, just that it would be forward. And that was enough. The story wasn't over, but it no longer belonged to the courtroom. Daniel Brooks learned the weight of quiet in the months that followed. Prison was not loud the way movies made it seem. It was structured, predictable. Days measured in routines instead of decisions. For the first time in his life, nothing responded to his confidence. No one cared who he used to be. At night, lying on a narrow bunk, Daniel replayed moments he once dismissed as insignificant. The casual lies, the shortcuts, the way he had treated trust like a renewable resource. It had never been renewable. He realized something slowly, painfully. He hadn't lost everything in court. He had lost it long before, when he stopped seeing people as people. Across the city, Sarah Williams was building a life that didn't need recovery. She moved to a smaller place near the water, not because she wanted a fresh start, but because she wanted simplicity. Mornings began with walks instead of emails. Evenings ended without anxiety. She didn't talk about the case. When people recognized her name and asked questions, she smiled politely and changed the subject. The story had served its purpose. It no longer needed retelling. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter forwarded through her lawyer. No return address, just a name she knew by heart. Daniel's handwriting was different now, less sharp, less practiced. He didn't apologize. Instead, he wrote one sentence. I finally understand that trust isn't something you take, it's something you protect. Sarah read it once. Then she folded the paper and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. Understanding didn't change the past, but it did close a door. Judge Michael Anderson presided over other cases. New disputes, new endings. On the surface, life returned to normal. But sometimes when a routine divorce crossed his bench, he paused longer than necessary. Sikhed names more carefully. Read deeds twice, because he had learned again that justice often hid in details, and that silence, when chosen carefully, could be powerful. Years later, the case would be referenced in legal lectures, not for its drama, but for its restraint, for the way it ended without spectacle. Students would ask why Sarah Williams didn't push harder. Professors would answer, because winning isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about leaving whole. On a quiet morning, Sarah stood by the water, watching the tide move in and out. She breathed deeply and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from being right, the kind that comes from being free. The world kept moving. So did she. And somewhere, unnoticed, a routine divorce case had changed everything. Simply because someone read a name carefully.